My name is Michael Levy. Everybody feel free to stand up, shake their arms and legs. I'm going to tell some stories. It's okay, you can all relax. Thank you. Nobody else thought that they could stand up and do that. I've been on this stage now for about 12 years, and for the first time I think I know what I'm going to say, and I'm not nervous and anxious, and you're all making me feel pretty relaxed about that. I had some great conversations last night. Thanks everybody for coming back after COVID. Does everybody remember not too long ago when none of us were coming to these events, or we were sitting at great distances and all masked up? Doesn't that feel like ancient history? So I'm going to tell you a story about this idea of pride and how I came to this particular sort of perspective and provide this service that says, I want to build pride in companies. If you can build pride in individuals, for the jobs that they do, you will make magic happen. And if you can build pride in the company as well, that's just icing on the cake. So how did this interesting journey start that says, how did I get here in front of you all today to talk about the idea of being proud of what you do as an individual contributor? So it started in an unexpected place. It was a restaurant. I had not taken a salary, I think, for 3 years because I was being entrepreneurial. And we were at an expensive, fancy restaurant with my wife and some friends. And I looked at the prices of the entrees and the appetizers and tightened up a little bit and said to my wife, "Why?" And she said, "They give airline miles." I'm like, "Really?" This is like in 2000. Airline miles. How many airline miles? Well, 500. 500 airline miles. What's 500 airline miles worth? $5. People do weird shit for airline miles, I said to myself. Right? Buying. Anyway, of course, now that we know that that little fad and trend didn't disappear. So I said to myself, whether it was exactly as a result of that connection, I'm going to build a company that builds these points programs. People do weird stuff for points programs. And so I had, 23 years ago this was, people asking me to build all sorts of different points programs. They'd ask me to build points programs for onboarding, sales incentives, wellness programs, participation in training, years of service, discretionary spot awards. And we'd watch all these companies building all these different sort of programs. Usually they were fairly siloed, certainly at the time, if you think about when we started doing this some 23 years ago. And we'd start to see that maybe they should overlap and connect and create a unified points program, etc. And some of them have certainly matured over those period of time. But I'm explaining the story of how I came to this idea of pride. One of the clients ran out of money. I'm like, okay. If you're not going to give out the points, I'm not sure what else there is to do then. And they said, no, we want you to tell stories. I'm like, okay. Tell me what you mean by telling stories. We want people to talk about each other. We want peers to tell stories about peers, and managers to tell stories about subordinates, and subordinates to tell stories about leadership, and the company to tell its stories as well. Technologically, that wasn't going to be a problem for us to do, even though I think back at those days of what we built for them relative to what we do now. But either way, we built this execution. The question was going to be to me, well, this is probably just writing on the wall before the contract doesn't get renewed. But that isn't what happened. It was a huge success. Right? Specifically, did I miss my slide? Maybe I lost a slide. Specifically, the stories were hugely successful, 20,000 of them. Here we go. 20,000 of them per month. And they were sort of much more textural than I thought that they would be. It wasn't just thanks. They were detailed stories about how employees had helped one another, and how managers had done this, and how examples had affected their customers, so forth. And I said, well, that's kind of interesting, stories. Why do people want to tell stories? So I said, Well, we're going to need to understand what this means, and so began the trajectory and transition to this idea of WorkProud and what we stand for now. And we said, well, we're going to do a bit of a study. We're going to study, one, why the stories and what's the role of the storytelling aspect, and two, if you do tell stories, how does that actually play out? So in 2000, we engaged Doctors Rick Garlick and Doctors Bob Nelson to go and investigate this question of WorkProud. If you're interested in copies of the 2020 version, there are some pamphlets and you can QR code scan them, and the 2024 release will come out on April 4th if you're interested in seeing the updated version to see what's changed over time in terms of the populations. And there's certainly some interesting and surprising things that you will find post-COVID and with remote populations, because those are the things that have changed. In addition to the fact that the populations are now defined a lot more by Gen Y and Gen Z over that time period. Now Gen Y and Gen Z are the majority of the populations. So we initiated this WorkProud study, and the study methodology was 1,000 interviews, various questions associated with, and let's sort of share some of the interesting findings. Firstly, pride. Two types exist. There is individual pride, and individual pride is tied to your job function and role. What it is that you do. Think about it in a context of Macy's as a retailer with all their different functions. Think about it as a hospital with all their different functions. You've got all sorts of different jobs, and as HR, we can't change any of their jobs. Their jobs are their jobs, and some of them are not very exciting jobs, and some of them are amazingly interesting jobs, and some have career paths opportunities, and some don't. But we can potentially affect people's perception of the value of their job. That's the only thing externally that we really can influence. We might be able to change the pay periodically, but we can change their perception of the job, and how we change the perception of job is telling people that they matter. Telling stories, right? Telling stories. And the stories are, you matter, we see you, the things that you do count. And it's free to tell stories. It doesn't require compensation, approval. And interestingly, as another dimension, if you ask yourself, you've got it in your own data sets, but you know people leave the business not because of the pay. They leave it for all sorts of other reasons. Eventually, they work out that they do get paid more. So you've got a free tactic and technique and an opportunity to make people feel that they count and that they matter and their jobs. So as HR people, you should go, that's my agenda anyway. And it also happens to fix business issues like retention and turnover rates. So the two types of pride we found and identified in the study was the individual pride, and what is that? And then the company pride, and what is that? So this is how the PhD guys and the doctors had sort of interpreted it. They said, if you can impact pride in the job that you do, the things you touch are pay satisfaction, discretionary effort, attendance levels, engagement, and job satisfaction. If you affect company pride, workplace advocacy, product advocacy, retention rates, employer branding, and sometimes profitability. They're kind of meaningful things that HR should care about. And you can all do it with stories and how to bring stories to life in the organization. So the summation of the study, again, the details of which we've got some copies here, or you can download them, is that for the employee population set that demonstrated high pride in the surveys, they were 10x more likely to be satisfied with their job overall. If they had high company pride, they were 24x more likely to stay at their current company. So that's the summary. So let's look at some of the interesting smaller data points that they identified that I thought was interesting to highlight. Pride in one's work is linked to high job satisfaction, engagement, pay satisfaction. So here are some of the highlights. I'm completely satisfied with my job, had a 10x delta. I look forward to coming to work every day in terms of absenteeism, had an 8x delta. I'm paid fairly for the value I create for my company, 7x. I go the extra mile, 4x. And I'm put more effort than other people do, discretionary effort, 24x. So interesting variables on the data sets so that if we have to go back and make the business case, there are very strong business cases. In terms of company pride, if I was offered significantly more money, had a difference of 46%, I would not change. I would strongly recommend my company as a place to work, advocacy 61%. So very significant and substantial, and I think all of you as HR professionals can relate to it in your own career trajectories of where you've been. You know, pay is certainly table stakes to get people to come and join the business in the first place, but it's not why people stay. They're staying for other reasons, right? And it's the question of, can we influence those other reasons? So in the study, no matter how much monetary incentive you provide to employees, if you don't address the non-monetary, then the intrinsic drivers such as pride and engagement, then having a high-performing culture will always be an elusive element to the process. So that's the sort of study in the background. As I mentioned, we'd done one in 2020 and then the more recent one in 2024. Seeing the change in the demographics of the population has certainly been interesting as we watched the natural tendency of pride diminish with the younger generation. The younger generation has a tendency to want to be appreciated and acknowledged as table stakes, meaning they're expecting this to happen, whereas older generations of Gen X and baby boomers, they expected to have longer careers at the companies and were not necessarily needing to be given some kind of recognition and acknowledgement and appreciation on an ongoing basis. But now in the recent survey we've done and seeing the data as the population moved and shifted, the younger generation is expecting this. They have much higher expectations of what the workplace is supposed to deliver for them in the context of, I see you, I appreciate you're valuable. They, of course, want other things like professional career development and promotions at the earliest opportunities. So we're suggesting that companies need to take a much more concerted effort in looking at the way in which those feedback loops are created and stories are told, particularly for the Gen X, Gen Y, especially in lieu of the turnover rates that we've all been seeing and going, well, why won't they stay and how do we get them more engaged and how do we connect with them? So that's the summary of the WorkProud study. You're welcome to, again, get some information on it. Karen and I think Karen is sitting down somewhere in the audience. If you have an interest in picking up a hard copy, we have hard copies here for you, or you can download them. And as a service, as a business, we're going to help companies assess the level of pride that exists within the organizations currently so that they can establish some baselines, compare their baselines to others in the industry to see what it looks like. And then if you want to, we'll help you design some programs that are designed to orientate to increase the storytelling that takes place inside the business, and from the storytelling gets the messages that say, hey, I see you, individual contributor in the business, and the things that you do matter, and we appreciate you for what you're doing. And if you get to that, you begin to tap into one of the main drivers of pride in the human psyche. So I don't know if there's any other questions that people wanted to ask, but otherwise it was a short and punctual story. All right. Very good. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to exercise my chair's prerogative and say the 5 words I never thought I'd ever hear myself say on stage, which